like you're doing now, deliberate about it.
Yes.
So
Good point.
Oops, Dr. Anderson and those got kicked out too, so they must have had good conversation as well.
I was like, we were right in the middle of a sentence.
Us too.
And I saw the time go down, but I didn't realize that it went down to 0.
You're right. I almost wanted to pick up the phone and be like, wait, what were you getting ready to say?
Yes.
That's hilarious.
It went from 58 seconds to 0.
0.
What?
Instantly. It was weird.
Yeah, it sure did.
That's frustrating. I don't know why I did that, but oh well.
I think it was a lag, an internet lag.
Ah, well, there's that. That we can count on. So is everybody back? Let's see. Looks like it. All right, so we're gonna have the superintendent and chair report out first, and y'all can finish your conversation. So how do you think y'all are doing currently with the evaluation process, and what needs to change?
Dr. Thomas, you want me to report out?
You can, I'll be quiet. Go ahead.
I give a summary that we felt like we're headed in the right direction. Like that there's still some growth, but we're headed in the right direction. That it also feels good to be like sort of laying the foundation together. Because as new board members, or as a new board member, 2 years, well, it seems like it's been 10, but I think it's only 2 years ago. Like I felt like we were just like, we came in the middle, like, when everything was already developed and things like that. And so it just took a while to even feel like I knew what was going on. So we talked about that. We also talked about how it is sort of a, just the whole superintendent evaluation process is like, it's important to all be on the same page because everyone needs to sort of understand like how is this tool going to be used, right? So like going back to like, what does the rating of 1 mean? If there are inconsistencies there. And so overall, I think we felt like it was going in a good direction. Also some elements of, like recently we had a policy conversation on really like power, the use of power sort of came up, and how that's important for board members too, because there is a power differential, and being sure that, when you assess a person, you're assessing them on the outcome, that you're not assessing them based on your feelings. And I know arguably, people would say there's no 100% objectivity, but if you have outcome measures, those help with that. They sort of help us, stay focused and be sure we're not evaluating people based on what we feel or our relationship with them, or, how many times, a person has said yes or no to something that we want and things like that. I think those were the 3 areas, but Dr. Thomas, you can.
That's it. You covered exactly what we said. We're definitely making progress, and I just appreciate the leadership provided from Dr. Dykeman in helping to make sure that we are not building the plane as we fly it. There are times you may have to do that, but I think that's what has hurt us in the past, is because when you make shifts mid-air, sometimes it doesn't play out so well.
All right, what group wants to go next? Dr. Yeager, how about your group?
Yeah, we had a good group. So we had Tawana and myself and Karina. So we had 3 different generations. And Tawana and I could remember what we did in December and what it felt like relative to the year before. And we definitely saw really big improvements. This is the December evaluation that we did, ensuring accountability, strengthening our relationship. We impacted the superintendent's development, we thought, because we renegotiated her contract and gave her the freedom to not be a substitute teacher anymore based on her performance. So I think we did all those things you highlighted at the beginning of what was part of a good process. So that's what we did there. And then with Karina, we looked at what have we been doing for the last 6 months. And I think we all agreed that we really like the way it's been going, a simpler strategic plan, a simpler metrics. It was very collaborative, and it was, it felt like we were doing it together. So we felt pretty good about it. The only thing we would change is that the sort of accountability piece, or how do we measure these things, that part felt a little bit like until the last minute, and then we got it to sort of look at, and recognizing that it's not our job to come up with that metric, but a little more transparency about how that metric, what it looks like and why those and not something else, or what was behind those metrics. I think we still are curious about whether we have a right to be curious about how she chooses the metrics. Karina had a great, maybe you want to tell it, Karina, about if you poll someone, if you're a mom and you ask your kids to rate you as a mom, and you only give them questions that show that you're a great mom, maybe you should be asking other questions. So we were I didn't do nearly as good a justice to that as you did, Karina. But anyway, we're curious about how we choose these metrics, and we understand it's not our role to choose them, but we would love a little more transparency about why those and not something else.
Gotcha. We're going to talk about those soon. Definitely.
And Tawana and Karina, did I remember things? Please chime in.
Excellent.
Covered you.
No comment.
All right. What about Greg and Mumby?
We focused a lot more on that latter part of Tish's summary on their discussion. Greg is a senior member and I am 6 months in. And so he's, he brought sort of the historic perspective of how the strategic plan was developed before, what was in the strategic plan prior to this year, and how it was the almost extreme polar opposite of what's happening now. And so I think where we were at when we got kicked out of the room is that there seemed to have been way too much emphasis on what was going to happen from the day to day, and so many measures, and the board just couldn't keep up, and it was just too much going on in the strategic plan and how it was going to be evaluated. And then now, as our previous as Tish discussed, it's the goals. We looked at the goals and the objectives, and it was not really our job to look at initiatives and key performance indicators. But there was still that question of, well, how are you going to measure this, and what instruments are you going to use, and are they going to be fair instruments? Are they going to be objective enough for you to? Are you going to change them every year? What's the sort of rule of all of these things that you are meant to accomplish? And I think it's very similar to what Tish is describing, that we don't know as a board what level, where we should cut that off, that interest in knowing what the operations to achieve those objectives and goals are going to look like. Should we look at them? Should we want to know? Should we be able to connect them to the goals before we approve them? That question is still kind of really looming in our heads. Greg, let me know if that's not a good enough summary. Is he here?
You might be talking.
I guess I have to verbalize. I had
He
the
gave you a
up.
thumbs up.
I had 2 thumbs up, but no, I think that's a very fair summary.
Okay.
So that's the reason why we split all the 3 new board members up into 3 different groups, because you haven't had as much experience with this, because we wanted to be fair to you guys. All right. So last but not least, Nicole and Linda and Kara. Who wants to report out?
I can. We didn't pick a spokesperson, but I think our discussion was probably very similar to what Lakeisha was discussing. in terms of current process, we also thought that we were moving toward a better process and a process that is similar to what you were describing in the beginning. So I think that we are definitely moving in that direction. The question of what needs to change, one thing that I know that I hope that we'll talk about in this training is the rating scales, and just making sure that everybody agrees with the rating scale and that way of rating. And then also that everybody understands what each level of the rating scale means. I know that we in the past had different interpretations of the rating scale, and that caused a lot of issues. And then maybe just like some specific examples of what constitutes a meeting, what constitutes an exceeding, if that is the scale that we ultimately decide to use. And then one thing that I just thought of that we didn't actually discuss, but you had mentioned that there are sometimes, like when you do, if you have a long strategic plan that's over like 5 years or something, that some things aren't going to be done until later years. And so is there a way to kind of put that in, and so that when we're evaluating, there would be certain areas that like, we're not going to evaluate that in year one, because that's really more of a, is that something that people do? Is that common?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, and it's sometimes it's not about whether that has been completed or not. It's about the steps that the administration has begun to take to move in that direction. Because some of the initiatives, you know, many times your strategic plan is a 3 to 5 year plan. And there's a phase 1 and sometimes a phase 2 and phase 3. And so in phase 1 it could be part 1 of implementation of something. And so whatever that part 1 represents is spelled out in the action plans that the superintendent has. And she'll have indicators, whether it's qualitative or quantitative, on measuring those. So you won't reach the end or completion yet, but you will have some clear anticipated steps to begin the process and move forward. So the answer, long response is yes, there's a mechanism for that. And that's why you have the conversation that you are beginning to have now, because you discuss those items, because it's going to fall within a certain strategic priority that you have, because you know which priority is it and what phase of implementation is it. So the answer is yes.
Okay.
And I will say, having struggled with the indicators as a board, that was our biggest issue. And we're going to talk about those in more detail in a minute, but you're not the only ones that struggle with the indicators. And what does a 4 mean? What does a 3 mean? What does a 5 mean? Depending on what measurement that you choose, because you can choose anything and put it in assembly. And what are those rubrics that exceed or meets or does not meet or needs improvement? And that's the key, because you want to be fair and you want to be as objective as possible and not subjective. So I think that's everybody, right? Yep. So it sounds like we're making progress this year.
Yeah.
That's very encouraging. Congratulations.
Julie, can I just say one thing, and it's not directly related to your question, but I know, you know, Kara and the superintendent evaluation committee, I just think it's such a huge undertaking. And then when Ms. Linda did it as well, it was such a huge undertaking. And, you know, it's sometimes like things like this help me understand that I didn't really know what I didn't know at that point. So I have a renewed appreciation for Ms. Linda and Dr. Dykeman, because this is, I mean, it seems like it's a lot, even in a simple, you know, in a simple way, even when they're simple goals and measurable goals, it's definitely a lot to, it's important and got to work, but it's a lot to take in, like for me as a 3rd year board member.
Oh, it is. It can be overwhelming. Having done it, been in charge of superintendent evaluations before, because it depends on how comprehensive it is and how much detail you're pulling from the strategic plan. And so that's why we recommend you not go easy on yourselves, but you don't overwhelm yourselves so that you're still up here, thinking up here and agreeing to what she needs to provide as evidence without being overwhelming. Because, you know, a superintendent is in charge of a lot of things. So, you know, whether what we used to do was we would give our superintendent no more than 5 goals for the year. And one of those goals was always, how many strategic plan metrics did she meet for that year? You know, all the action plans. So like if she got, we come up with the rubric, if she got 70% or over, it's exceeding. Or, you know, I don't even remember what it was, but we agreed upon that with her in the front end, so that when we went through the process of figuring out what we met in our strategic plan based on student data, based on finances, based on all the other things that we were hitting in the 5 overarching goals we had, it was pretty clear, you know. And then sometimes we'd pull special things out. Like last year, you might have pulled out, how do you handle COVID? You know, how do you deal in a pandemic? Or how do you deal with annexation? Or, you know, we need to pass a GO bond. You know, those are the types of things that you might not have had in your strategic plan originally, but they came up mid-year or mid-plan. And you want to put those important things in there so that, you know, the superintendent's going to be working towards it and he or she can meet that metric or not. Sam, any thoughts on her comment?
No, all of those are important. But I was thinking as I was listening, the other piece from the superintendent's standpoint is that the reason that those formative reports are important is that it gives the superintendent an opportunity to keep you updated and abreast of what she is having to do to make adjustments in some cases. Because sometimes you should anticipate that sometimes things are going to progress beyond what she expected. And so she'll make some adjustments with that timeline or maybe even metrics. And sometimes her team will discover that, hey, there are some obstacles that have been presented that we're facing now that we didn't anticipate, like COVID, that's an example that we've never had before us. And so it may not be a good one, but as they are implementing, she could find that there were more examples of children that entered at the kindergarten level that didn't have pre-K exposure, and they were not at a point where they had letter number recognition like they thought and anticipated. So if so, her team might have recommended to her that they shift gears on implementation of something. So, and it doesn't mean that they stopped doing the work. It means that the means that she was moving forward with are being adjusted. So it gives her an opportunity to say that to you real time and then upload information about that so that it's just not so it's dynamic, in other words. So, and that's what I was thinking in terms of this whole process, and that's important too. Dr. Thomas, I don't know if you've had examples like that or not, or if that's something that has been in the forefront and beginning to utilize this whole process or not. So I love your thoughts on that.
Yeah, I was thinking as you talked, I think sometimes it could just be a matter of evaluating some type of intervention. You know, I was thinking about initiatives, and we really could have assumed that there was some product or some project that was going to be high leverage and you know, very functioning, and then it doesn't work. It may be maybe a partnership that we were going to have. I'll just say UGA, where we were counting heavily on having a professor help to lead some kind of PL, and something happens. And we actually had that with a professor that ended up having some major heart issues. And she was doing a lot of work with some of our new teachers. And it didn't stop the work, but it did slow the work. And so
Right.
it might not end an initiative, but at least making the board aware that here's a key person that was leading this induction work, and we've had to go out, seek someone. We're still doing it. We're moving forward, but we may have had, like, a month or 6 week slowdown and what that looked like, and we're picking it back up. And so it may impact the data at the end, it may not, but at least making the board aware of that in real time. Then if there's something, I would think at the end, at least it was explained, in advance. So that was kind of one of
Right.
the things that came to my mind as you were talking.
Right. Okay.
It's
Great
important
points.
though, when new things are added unexpectedly, that the expectation for something else needs to go away. So you're still working on all of it, but that's why it's so important to have that discussion and that informal discussion to say, hey, I'm not going to be able to make this goal because this is pulling me this way, so that there's no surprises. So how do you make the whole process effective? And as you've heard us say before, the state law says you've got to do it at least once a year. And we always recommend the mid-year formative, which can be informal. And it sounds like y'all have done that this year, correct? That's what I'm hearing, right?
Yep.
And it should be constructive. You should be able to be honest with each other and provide direction if there's a certain direction that's not being met. But it's definitely a back and forth, and it's a lot of information gathering as well for the board, hearing from the superintendent's perspective. Again, it should always be based on the standards, goals, objectives, and initiatives defined from your strategic plan, which is what y'all are working on now, which is great. Agree on those expectations and the instrument to be used at the beginning, and we can't stress that enough, because sometimes instruments can be overwhelming or not as effective. And if you've used something in previous years and it hasn't been working, then do the research ahead of time and figure out something else. But you've got to agree on it as a team so that you're both comfortable with it. And of course, you should be trained on it, on that, whatever that instrument is. So when you're loading that information, like in Assembly, and you come up with those indicators that you've determined, because it's unique to every board, you need to agree on what those rubrics are for each of those grading areas. And we'll break those out in a little bit for more explanation and more discussion. And I believe y'all have been trained on Assembly. And if you haven't, before the evaluation at the end of the year, whenever y'all are going to do this, we'll be happy to train you so you know how to use it. It's pretty easy. Lisa could probably train you on it because she's become an expert. Have y'all come up with a timeline? Did you come up with that timeline at the beginning of the year? Like Sam mentioned earlier, usually in July or August, you start figuring out the timeline for the next year, or at the end of this evaluation process, whether it's in June, to figure out, okay, when are the next goals and objectives going to be laid out for the superintendent? When is she going to get back to us? Usually what we did was we started from the perspective of the superintendent. She presented us with her ideas, and then we talk about them. And then we'd have ideas, and then we'd come together and determine what those main overarching goals were going to be for the year. And of course, it was always based along the strategic plan. And you approve that timeline, and then you hold the meeting to discuss the findings. And then it results in an action plan for improvement if there are any. And the next slide gets into more detail, I believe it's the next slide, about the process. So we've talked about the mid-year when you're scheduling the evaluation. And then you want to make sure that, because things get busy, especially at the end of the school year, you want to make sure you get that executive session on your calendars 2 months prior or however much, but you owe it to your superintendent. She owes it to herself to make sure that it gets done and it doesn't get pushed back. We were guilty of that because things would always get in the way. Building that instrument, again, you've already done it, looks like. You've started the process in Assembly. You've aligned it to your strategic plan. We're going to look at that in a few minutes. Agree on those expectations and indicators, and that's where the superintendent provides most of that data. And then determine that rating scale to be used. And then conducting the annual performance review think the next slide gets into the detail of that. And typically, well, maybe it doesn't. The best practice is that the superintendent, once everything's agreed upon.
Julie, Dr. Dykeman, I think, has a question
Sure.
or comment.
I just wanted to clarify, because you mentioned that you gave your superintendent like 5 overarching goals each year. And so are those the things that you then evaluated the superintendent on, or did you evaluate on the entire strategic plan?
So interestingly enough, we used 2 different instruments. So one of them was aligned to like every single thing that a superintendent does from, you know, it's basically the 8 domains, you know, the budget, staff, all the things, student achievement. And it's kind of like the operational, how was she doing operationally? And then we would pull out, because we gave her a bonus, we'd pull out 3 to 5 special goals for the year, and how many she met, she depended on the ratio of what she got in terms of her bonus. Now, quite frankly, she hated the bonus. She didn't really want it, but we forced it upon her. And she just wanted to be judged really on everything. So what we recommend, though, is no more than 5 overarching goals. And it's usually tied to the strategic plan. What we did was one of her goals was the whole plan. And how many, you know, we would have those report cards as to how many goals we had met that year in terms of the percentage. And if we were killing it, then she got a great rating for that, if she exceeded expectations. And we had the metrics already laid out as to what those percentages were. So she wasn't surprised and caught off guard before we went and met to determine the goal the rating we were going to give her. Does that help answer your question? It was a little bit too much at the time, and it burned us all out. So we did it differently the next year, and then GSBA came up with this, and we started using this, and it was much easier. So
I just wanted to make sure I was clear on the strategic plan goals versus your goals that you set each year.
Yes, and it can change. It depends on the board and what you want to do. We just had one main goal of meeting the strategic plan initiatives and what percentage she was doing. And sometimes we really were focused on something, and we always focused on the achievement gap. So we pulled that one out, and that was a whole separate, and that was one of our overarching 5 goals in the strategic plan. And the first year she was there, we really needed to work on climate and culture in our community. And that was a huge one. So we pulled that one out as well.
So these special goals that you said for each year were not additional things. They were specific things from the strategic plan that you pulled out.
Some were additional because things came up. Like our city was constantly wanting to annex into DeKalb County, which would affect our buildings. And we're only 4 square miles, right? So, and we had to pass a geo bond to get all these buildings built. And so that was a separate goal.
Okay.
Working with the city commission was a separate goal, because that wasn't in our original strategic plan, because it wasn't an issue 2 years before that. You know what I mean?
Okay.
And so it's kind of like COVID. I would have pulled something away and said, okay, how are we going to deal with COVID? You know, because that's a whole different paradigm that superintendents hadn't planned on at the beginning of the year when this hit us in March of last year. So, but every board is different, and you just have to go with what works for y'all and what y'all agree upon. But I'm here to tell you, don't overwhelm yourselves, because it was a lot. Our poor superintendent survived it, thankfully.
And the major thing is you want the evaluation to reflect what you are saying as a governance team is important that your organization should be doing, which is the strategic plan if you've done it in a way that it's a living, breathing process. And so it's a little bit different, yet similar to, in terms of what Julie said, because I heard her say in the end that they did end up with this kind of rollout. Because if you've got those 5 items in your strategic plan, and you say that those are the things that if you do well with implementing and achieving goals that it's going to result in success for your children. That's what you're saying, that body of work. So that then should be the core of the substance that you're using for evaluation purpose. Now, it is true that though you may have 5 strategic priorities and it's a 5-year strategic plan, then there's a different timeline for implementation within each of those priorities. So that then drives what you are agreeing on for that year. So your conversation with Dr. Thomas and Dr. Thomas's conversation back to you is going to be about strategic priority number 1, phase 1. Here's what we're going to be doing this year. And from that, you pull your items that you're going to use from that strategic priority to move into evaluation. So those are the kinds of things that you need to be looking at, because then the only thing that then would result in you adding something to her would be if you felt like those 5 strategic priorities didn't get to something that you think was burning in your organization. That doesn't sound right. Something that you think was important that was not in your strategic plan. For example, just it could be providing, you want her to, how she connects with the community. Maybe you've got an issue and it's not in your strategic plan. Providing leadership to the external and internal audience or something like that. If it's not there, then that's a leadership piece that you could decide that you're going to add in. But it won't be a lot of additional pieces that you add outside of the strategic plan unless your strategic plan is not built in an effective manner. So in my view, a lot of what Julie mentioned earlier reflects those things that they were doing to get to the point of agreeing on probably their final strategic plan, maybe, Julie. So because if
because the thing is as you said before, Sam, it's like you got to crawl before you can walk, before you can run. And like the first thing we needed to do was be fiscally healthy because we were about to go bankrupt. So she had to focus on that. That was an essential goal in the beginning. And she nailed it the first year and we were fine. So that wasn't as much of a focus in the predecessor following years. Other things were, it's like if you've got a neighborhood of houses and one's on fire, you focus on the one that's on fire. And sadly, we had to put up a lot of fires instead of being strategic. We were kind of being reactionary because she inherited some issues when she came. So it changes. That's the thing. It's a fluid document. But the thing about the strategic plan is you have to remember those overarching goals, those don't really change over the 5 years. It's what happens underneath in those yearly things and those action steps. And we'll talk about more of that when we get to your evaluation here in a minute. Don't know if that helps.
Mm-hmm.
Great.
What that makes me think of is Dr. Thomas has done, in my opinion, a very effective job in working with Cognia. And that is something that we have not credited her for. It wasn't part of the strategic plan, doesn't belong there. But I think in terms of her efforts in that regard, we should have recognized it perhaps in the evaluation instrument.
That's an excellent example of something that's come up that typically isn't in your strategic plan at the time. What were you saying, Linda?
I was saying that I think that, again, that gets kind of into that space we weren't going to talk about today or go into today. But I was concerned that I'm really grateful to hear that there's a way, and I know that there's always a way to modify the strategic plan. And so I just want to clarify my understanding of that process. And so if we have a strategic plan and specifically in our group, I talked about the initiatives, not necessarily once we got the initiatives, if they didn't match the vision that we had for where we wanted the district to be, then there was room for negotiation. Either change the vision, change the goal, or look at those initiatives and do something different. And I wanted to make sure that we speak to the flexibility of doing that, because I think we keep saying overarching, and that's a really critical word, but it also is the vision that we have for the district. And so the initiatives, if we can't see the connection to that vision, then I think that is the point of negotiation, and all that's done long before we sign off on a strategic plan. And I wanted to make sure we talked about that. And the other thing, just
and I think though, Linda, it's critical that you have those conversations
yes,
evaluation even starts a year before.
long before it starts, absolutely. And that was the other thing that I wanted to hear.
And boards will have that conversation when they're in the process of reviewing the superintendent, and that's not fair to the superintendent.
Exactly.
You know, they hadn't thought about it in those
Yeah.
contexts, in that context before they started this. So it's
Right.
really critical you have those difficult conversations early, and you have them with the superintendent. Okay.
And
Well,
that's the main thing. Okay, it's collaboration on that point, right? So I was curious about the I don't know who could do this in 1 year. I mean, that's just a long time to wait to see how you're doing or know how you're doing. So I'm grateful that our policy calls for a mid-year, a midterm, and the final evaluation. And of course, one is summative and the other one is not. So I think that part was very good in our policy.
And in addition to that, you know, what the evidence and information that's uploaded, even from the beginning of your implementation cycle up until mid-year, then
Right.
gives you a wealth of information and examples of what's being done linked to that. So it gives you an opportunity to do that. And you have a check-in at mid-year to talk about where you are. And the flexibility in it is not around you having a need to change your strategic priorities or the goals and objectives which you've developed, because those are those 30,000 foot view things that you said you had to do because of what your data analysis said. So that's how you ended up with those strategic priorities and goals and objectives. Those initiatives are those things that we use as examples that the superintendent and her administration were putting together to go in the direction of meeting your goals and to get to the strategic priority. And it gives her the flexibility to say that an initiative needs to be adjusted, because when she's presenting to you, she might suggest that we need to adjust an initiative or we need to accelerate an initiative because we're moving pretty quickly through this. So
that's encouraging. Okay.
yeah, it gives you that, but you know those other pieces are still there as far as your 30,000 foot view goals and strategic priorities, but what you're doing to meet them could change. And it just makes sense because if you're doing real-time analysis of the work from a formative standpoint, and that's going to happen. So
Right.
so
Okay, well, that's good to know.
any other thoughts before we start talking about the rating terminology?
I heard you mention we were going to load this in Assembly. What does that mean? Is there does it fit with our policy in terms of how we aggregate our results, or maybe we'll have another session about Assembly at some point?
In terms of your policy,
Yes.
I'm not sure what your policy says, but I know what we've done is we've gone ahead and Lisa has loaded in the strategic priorities, the overarching goals, and the performance objectives, which is what y'all have apparently agreed upon. And what's not loaded in is of course, the initiatives and the action steps and the evidence and that sort of thing.
I think I've been absent then, so thank you. Appreciate it.
Yeah, well, this just happened this week. So we wanted to, since y'all had approved that part of the strategic plan, we wanted to go ahead and put it in Assembly, and we can walk through it together, maybe on that first one, and see, you know, where you guys are, how you feel about it, and just have a discussion about your actual strategic plan and those goals. And, you know, we're not sure where y'all are in that process, if y'all have agreed upon that those are the measurements that you're going to use for her for next year, because this is going to be for next year, I'm assuming.
and it just gives you an example of what it could or would look like, because if those things change, of course, then what you see that's been dropped in will change. So it's not, once you look at it, that's your end all be all. It's just a kind of an indication of what it looks like right now that you can take a look at it. So.
And so this is what I've mentioned before. I think Sam has too. This is where we can get bogged down and not agree with each other when it comes to the actual rating. On the day that you're individually rating the superintendent, me, myself, and I'm going to go into Assembly and I'm going to rate her based on, let's say it's these 4 rubrics. And you want to make sure what what does exemplary look like? And so the rubric here, if you read that, that is the evidence that will clearly say that she has exceeded proficient. She's exceeded the Met's expectations. And this
Julie,
is
we have a question from Dr. Anderson, I believe.
Sorry, I didn't want to interrupt you while you were speaking. Okay, so before you move into this section, I just needed 2 points of clarification. So we will get the Assembly training because I've never seen Assembly, so I don't know what that is. And the second question, when it comes to the evaluations that are happening right now, none of us new members understand what's going on with this year's evaluation. So the strategic plan that's being approved now is effective in July for next year's evaluation. Is there something that we should be preparing for this year's evaluation, or has that already happened?
I guess that's a question for Dr. Dykeman or Dr. Gantz or Dr. Thomas. Where are y'all with this year's? It sounds to me like y'all had an informal formative back in what, January or December?
We did have an informal formative. I mean, it's a great question. I think that because we didn't have a strategic plan going into this year that was finalized, we haven't really, I mean, I don't know. I guess the answer is that we don't really know where we are for this year.
You haven't done
But you know you have to do it. You're going to have to do a summative. That much you do know.
Yeah.
So you need to, this will help you begin to think about what it is that you have been measuring all through January, December, and what those things are, and when are you going to do. You don't have to answer this for me because I'm not asking a question. I'm just throwing these things out as points to ponder for you, because once you get to the summative standpoint, you don't want to have surprises. You don't want to surprise your superintendent, and then you don't want to be surprised as a board. And I'm not saying that's what you're going to do, but the mere notion that we're having the discussion then would suggest that you all need to probably come together at some point to make sure that you prepare for that.
Yeah, I mean, I think the issue is that all of this that we're talking about now, which is going to be great for next year because we are doing all of this on the front end and making these agreements on the front end so that everybody, including Dr. Thomas, knows what she'll be evaluated on starting in the new school year. That's just not something that happened last year. So we don't have that basis to start from, to say like, yes, we all agreed on all of these things and that's what we're being evaluated on for, a number of reasons that didn't happen last year. So, I mean, I guess this is probably a conversation we have to have with Dr. Thomas and figure out exactly how to do that for this year.
Well, when y'all met a few months ago and did an informal, do you know what she was being measured on? Or I know y'all gave her feedback. So what were you using then?
Well, I mean, we had the previous strategic plan, and then she had like a draft of the strategic plan, and it's not, the overarching goals are not terribly different than what they were previously. So we talked about, those things, but again, there was not a finalized strategic plan that we went through to have that evaluation.
And we didn't have metrics really. And I guess we shifted to a school year versus a calendar year, correct?
Yeah.
And so that was one shift that was made.
Yes. Yeah. So we did do it, partway through the school year. And that was a recent change. So everything kind of shifted, and we do have a timeline, everything going forward. That's what I was saying earlier. I feel like going forward and we're moving in the direction of doing all of these things that you talked about in the beginning. And so I do think that like for next year, we will have all of this process, but it is true that we still have to do this year.
Fairness to her, you have to give some type of feedback this year before you
Right.
go forward with the new. As long as that's on your radar, that's the key.
And I think that, to echo Kara, I do think that will be a conversation that we have to have relatively soon. Because even, in part of me, I was like, great, we'll have a tool, we'll have all of our strategic things up, lined up. But then the other part is like, wait a minute, but we have no real base. I mean, like, we haven't even talked about like, this is where we start and this is where we finish, like those types of things. So even with the data and the outcomes, but we will have to use something. We will have to give feedback on something. And so it sounds like we'll probably need to.
I think we just need to have a conversation about that, because I don't think I think we need to have that meeting with Dr. Thomas to talk about that for sure.
Yeah, I think I agree with that. And so I guess to answer Dr. Anderson's question, I was just agreeing with Kara that we don't quite know where we are with the exact tool that we're going to be using, but hopefully some of what we learn and we're going over tonight will help inform our evaluation that's coming up.
Thoughts, questions?
Well, let me say this, Julie, the example on the screen of rating terminology is just that. It is just an example. This is not to suggest that this is what you must use.
Right.
It's just an example of what a rating scale could look like. And you may have something similar to this or very similar to this already. You just have to agree on it each time and understand how you're measuring. And this just gives you a snapshot of what it could look like. Okay, Julie?
So let me say thank you for that snapshot thing, because what I see here is, again, these categories seem to work if you absolutely have an initiative that you are evaluating in this particular time period. And so I wouldn't want to see something hit ineffective or needs development if it's one that we came to the agreement that we would, maybe do that later, or something else became a higher priority. What would we do if we have an initiative that we've agreed upon as a part of the evaluation that, again, circumstances come up or something came up that was more important, and you didn't, you kind of agreed not to put the work into it? What do we do with that? Ineffective doesn't sound like it fits. That's the kind of thing I'm asking about. Is there any logic in making sure that we can have something that we're just not evaluating because it's not appropriate?
Well, I noticed that Dr. Deitman, I got the document that she said that she put into your strategic plan, and one of the rating categories she added was insufficient data to rate, which that could apply to, because it was kind of taken off the table. And
wow.
you can just take it off the table if you want. But sometimes the superintendent is providing evidence. You haven't had a discussion with her maybe about it. You're individually rating her, but you don't see the evidence there. Instead of giving her ineffective or needs development, you could just put insufficient data to rate. And then you can allow her the opportunity, after the board meets and has discussion about it, she can provide that data after the fact before y'all get together as a team to go over it. And we'll talk about the actual steps to the superintendent evaluation. I think it's the next slide. But the beauty of Assembly is you can put in any kind of rating that you want, any kind of rubrics that you want. Y'all just all have to agree to them. I mean, I had a board member, I think at 1 year it was like 1 to 5, 5 being, knocked it out of the ballpark, 3 being met the goal, 4 being above average. And he would never give a 5 because he's like, well, then she won't be motivated to do anything next year. I'm like, no, she has to blow it out of the ballpark next year. So don't agree to have a 5 if nobody can ever achieve it. And so we would butt heads about that. And so you want to make sure that all y'all are on the same page, and this terminology means the same thing to each of y'all, including Dr. Thomas. Because it can be demoralizing and demotivating to a superintendent if that doesn't happen.
And 9 times out of 10, you're going to know that you're going to need to shift an initiative if you're doing those quarterlies. And because then that's when the superintendent will bring it to your attention that initiative needs to be adjusted. And you're able to hear her talk about what that adjustment needs to be real time. So that's the benefit in the quarterly updates that's tied to the strategic plan. Because if you are just waiting on most of that kind of conversation until the summative, it doesn't lend itself to those kinds of opportunities. So that's something that you can look forward to going forward too. I know that one's what we're preparing to do, and it doesn't help you right now.
Right.
But if you're going to do a summative and you have an initiative that's there that you can't rate, it's probably because those ongoing formative discussions and updates, you didn't have them, because that gives you an opportunity to change those midstream or from a formative standpoint. You don't change your goals and your priorities, but what she's doing as far as the initiative to meet those, then she lets you know that needs to be tweaked or changed.
Let me just ask a question, and we didn't do a lot of this in my previous experience with superintendents either. We tried to meet a couple of 3 times a year, at least, to sit down and just have those status updates and conversations to make sure that we're kind of lining up. But I don't know that we were that successful in doing that. Is that a typical thing, or do you guys just never discuss that in your previous experience? You just only had it at the time of evaluation? Because I would think that there would be plenty of opportunity to have those conversations more often than at mid-year and at the end of the year.
We did a quarterly update typically.
Mhm.
And then we would do a deep dive in the summer at our retreat. We'd really look at a lot of the data, because we use map data, which is, ongoing, immediate, and throughout the year. But unfortunately, the CCRPI and the CRCT data didn't come out until much later. And
Right.
policy says to evaluate in September, October, when those metrics are out, so that you can better evaluate your superintendent. But to me, it's an ongoing process. Sometimes it's a monthly conversation, because if she's working that plan, if y'all are working that plan, then there shouldn't be any surprises.
I totally agree. Okay, great. Thank you very much.
Sam, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that as a superintendent perspective.
No, I mean, that's a quarterly process. What that you just described, really, that's what it amounts to, is that you're doing quarterly updates. That doesn't mean you're sitting down and doing a full-fledged evaluation, but those quarterly updates are linked to all the things you just mentioned. And it's an update where you are getting up where you are with the strategic plan and priorities that are being implemented at that particular time. And so that could help mitigate what you just mentioned about those initiatives. And that's really the only way that that's going to happen, because if you don't commit to those formative checks, then you're going to always struggle with the other piece. But it depends on how you want to work. There are teams that do not like that. There's some that say, hey, we're not going to be doing quarterly updates. We're not going to do that number of times during the year. We're just going to do a mid-year discussion and a summative. And it works for them. So, that's up to you as a team.
So does the size of the team matter?
Size of your team
Yeah, this would be so easy if it's a 3-person team or a 5-person team. It's challenging when you have 9 people.
Yeah, your team, the size of your team is unique. So
yeah, because I keep getting surprises. I'm sorry, I'm getting surprises all the time here. It's not a comfortable feeling.
Well, it's hard when you have 9 people. And imagine if you're Richmond County, you have 10. Imagine if it's a 5-5 vote. It's hard to get anything done sometimes with a large team like that. So, there's a lot more perspectives to consider and to listen to. So, any other thoughts or questions about the rating rubrics?
I have a question. When you talk about the quarterly updates, these are more like public conversations, like sharing data about where we are, not necessarily executive session mini evaluations?
No, it can be both, actually. You definitely want to make sure that when you're updating the strategic plan in those objective types of rubric that you're trying to meet those goals, it's good for the whole staff and the community and parents to hear that. But if things need to shift and all, you need to have those types of conversations
And
executive session. If she feels I'm really not comfortable meeting this goal because of this, this, and this, you want to have that in executive session out of respect for her.
Okay, thanks.
Right. And so, and that, what that means is that, you know, those quarterly updates are about the work at when that, and that's being done within the strategic plan and implementation and all of that. So those things are the things that you're evaluating your superintendent on if you're doing it. But that's just reports on progress that her team is making to you on those priorities. If you go the quarterly route, some governance teams decide that they want to do the quarterly checks too from the evaluation standpoint. And then once that you complete what we just described, which is the public piece from the organization about how things are moving within all of those buckets about the work, then in your executive session, your conversations then are about how you're evaluating those pieces with the superintendent. So the way the quarterly updates are done compared to the way you do your executive session conversation about these, if you're going to do quarterly checks, those are different and two different things. And so you have to, but it's linked to the same type of information that you're measuring, which is your strategic plan. So, which is what you'd be doing if you're doing midterm as well. Because if you're not doing quarterly reports and everything's linked to your strategic plan, surely if you haven't gotten quarterly updates on the strategic plan at the midterm standpoint, you're probably getting an update on where you are with what you're doing, with what Dr. Thomas and her team is doing, and how they're progressing at that point. And then you go into executive session on the evaluation side. So, you know, it's the same process, same approach with that, except you're not doing it as many times. So pros and cons, depending on how you like to work as a team to it.
Dr. Anderson, do you have a question? Your hand's up, or did it just not come down from before?
Nope, I just didn't unraise it. I'm sorry. I'll go into I'll go in and unraise it.
So basically the steps, the best practice steps, the how-tos is once you've set all the stuff to get to the actual performance review, the superintendent goes into Assembly, let's say, because y'all use Assembly, and provides, uploads all the evidence and gives her own self-assessment, how she thinks she's done. Then each of you will go into Assembly and see all the evidence, see what her thoughts are, and then you rate her based on the evidence and the indicators provided. Once that happens, you come together as a team, and it might be Dr. Gann or Dr. Deitman, whoever is the head of your committee that's handling this, leads the discussion of the board through each of the goal areas, and y'all come up with a consensus per goal area. So you might rate her just proficient on something, and somebody might bring something up that she really knocked it out of the ballpark, so she gets exemplary. And then you vote in the majority rules as to what you determine her rating is and what comments you want to include, overarching comments, kind of like what we did for your self-eval, that she will see. I mean, you can cut and paste all the comments. She might want to see all the comments. And if I were y'all, I would talk to her about what she wants. Does she want to know that Dr. Gantt isn't happy with her performance in this? Does she just want a broad perspective? Some superintendents want to know, you know, where they stand. So y'all need to decide that together. And whatever that input is from the superintendent, y'all work together to come up with those overarching comments and the goals for each objective and goal area. And then once the board has voted on everything and comes to consensus, Typically, it's the board chair. It could be Dr. Dykeman if she's in charge of this as the committee member. Doesn't matter. It's whatever y'all want. She sits down with the superintendent one-on-one. And then the superintendent hears the evaluation, and she can provide clarification on some things. She can provide more evidence if there wasn't enough evidence to something, and she can give her input back. And then, that's when you meet with the whole governance team, including the superintendent, and y'all have a full discussion about it. So you know where everybody stands. And then a written summary of the evaluation is given at that point, and it's updated to reflect additional and modified expectations for next year. And this is a good time to start talking about next year's expectations and goals, to give the superintendent time to think about them before she starts the process over and approaches y'all with what she thinks the next year will be. Sam, you want to add anything to that?
No, I think this is like capturing kind of in the end all of what we were talking about to get us to this point. So, no, I think we touched on it in terms of the review itself. The only thing I would guess I will add here is that when you see the example that we're going to show you of your own work and what it could look like, you'll see examples of having to score the high level piece, but there are a lot of indicators or initiatives that you're going to look at to get to that. So you'll see an example of those, that process too.
Mm-hmm. Any questions on that part?
So it's about
concluded.
it's about 8:23. It's about 8:23. So we probably ought to give about a 5-minute transition break, a stretch break.
Yeah.
And we'll come back and be ready to look at the examples at 8:30. It gives us at least 30 minutes to take a look at that and be ready to conclude at 9. Everybody in agreement with that? Be back at 8:30?
Sounds good.
Okay, cool.
Thanks.
So Julie, you want to try to, I'll stop sharing and then try to shift to the assembly component.
Do you see it up there, Sam?
Yes,
Okay, great.
I see prepare every student for college and career success.
Yeah, and so here's the overarching, there's the goal for that indicator, and then middle school. And here's some of the evidence. It looks like she loaded in everything. I think so, yeah. So we'll start with that one. I will be right back.
All right.
Hey, Miss Linda.
So you're building this in Assembly, Kara?
No, I've never used Simbly, so I'm glad we're using it because I think it'll make it easier. But Lisa put this in based on that document that I sent you guys late last week, which was just taken from the strategic plan. And these ratings are just examples. I mean, we still have to decide as a group what we want to use as a rating scale. But just to have something in there. And then also, I know we have not we haven't agreed on the performance measures yet, but those are in here too, just again, as like a placeholder so that we could see what this would look like.
Thank you.
Word of advice from all of my experience, which is limited, and my friends' experience who do data analysis, don't ever use 5 metrics because people will just go right in the middle. You have to kind of like go above the line of exceeds or meets expectations or not, or needs improvement. So 4 is better than an odd number, apparently, whether it's 1 to 3, 1 to 5.
That's not been my experience with the previous boards.
Apparently.
Nobody does the middle. Everybody has strong feelings. So.
Yeah, well, that is true. But psychologically, apparently, there's something about the odd numbers. It's just fun.
Yeah. I look for them, but yeah, it doesn't work that way sometimes.
Yeah.
I think this is too important for people to do, take shortcuts like that.
It looks like everybody's back. I think. Karina, are you there?
I'm here.
All right. Yay. Okay, so here we have what we've loaded. So from what I understand, goal number 1 is prepare every student for college and career success. And y'all have agreed upon these 5 major goals, correct? Is that a correct assumption? Okay.
Yes.
And y'all have also agreed upon the performance objectives like this one, the early childhood, elementary, increase the number of students who demonstrate progress, all that. Y'all have approved that as well. In terms of your strategic plan.
I don't know that
I don't think we have.
I think we did the priority goals and objectives.
Yes.
Right, but not the performance measures.
That's what we were going to come back and talk about, I think is what we agreed on, right?
Right, I'm talking about 1.1, this up here, not the evidence, but early childhood, elementary, increase the number of students who demonstrate progress as measured by student growth percentiles.
Yes, so we had an elementary goal, a middle school goal, and a high school.
Right. And those have been agreed upon, right?
Yes, I think it just looks differently to people. I'm trying to pull up our plan. So that is what, so we had a goal was prepare every student for college and career success. Then the objective 1.1 was increase the number of students who demonstrate progress as measured by student growth percentiles on state and district English language arts and math. And that was where Dr. Anderson, I think it kind of alluded to some of what you had asked us about. That's where we looked at early Head Start, pre-K, those kinds of initiatives. Then the 1.2 was at least 90% or more of 8th grade students will be high school ready. And then 1.3 was ensure all of our high school seniors graduate college and career ready.
So I'm understanding that 1, 2, and 3 here, out of the overarching prepare every student for college and career, is what y'all have voted on recently about the strategic plan that y'all are agreeing on.
Yes.
Okay, excellent. That's a great start. Because when it comes to, this is where we can get bogged down. And I talked to Steve Barker yesterday. He's in charge of our strategic planning process, former superintendent, and he's just premier expert on this stuff. And some boards like to approve everything, you know, all at once, even all the initiatives and the indicators and all that. But that's not typically where a board needs to lie. You need to do what you've already done here with prepare every student. So your first goal is student achievement, obviously, and then you've got these broken down, and that's where a board lives. You know, it's like, where are you going? The other stuff is the how you're going to do it, and that's where a board does not get involved, and that's why it's incumbent on the superintendent and staff to come up with the evidence, the indicators, the measures, the action, whatever you want to call those.
So where does the SMART goal show up? Because that's the thing that triggers me or trips me, is when we say like what percent of 9th grade students earning 5 qualifying credits toward on track and graduation is, I don't know, are we talking about in this school year? Are we talking about in 3 years? I need to know something more here in terms of understanding how we evaluate that.
And so that's a really good point. What your superintendent and staff need to do is they're going to have baseline data. Mm-hmm. So they're gonna know what the baseline is. So what is the goal? Is it 2% increase? Is it a 5% increase? And that's where, you know, from the baseline for the next year, that's what the staff really needs to work on.
And we have that baseline data. So like if we look at for our performance measures, we have like percent. So for that first one, we have percent of CCSD pre-K students entering kindergarten on grade level. And we have 29.7% for reading, 37.4% for math. We have percent of grade K3 students experiencing 1 year or more growth on the English language arts and math assessments. And we have those percentages for reading and math. And then we have that same, so our performance measures are not, our goals don't have those percentages. Our percentages are in our performance measures / indicators.
Gotcha. So the evidence though, those are the
things. It's there, yes. We have all of that there. Now we have that baseline data already here. So it's just a matter now of the board determining which of those measures they want. And then our team has already pulled that data for each of those areas in areas where we have baseline data. Now there's some performance measures that we don't have data for yet, places where we're beginning surveys, looking at perception, like if we're looking at culture and climate or one of our human capital and development goals, and we may be looking at teacher perception of being supported or something in schools. I'm throwing that out vaguely. So there's a survey that's being utilized, a school climate survey. We don't have that baseline data. So we will have to determine that year one. But for all of our student achievement goals, we already have that baseline.
Right.
So then you'll drop that in and share that with the board as you all build that, right? And I think that gets to the question that was posed. Then it clarifies for the board where your baseline is and how much growth you feel that you are able to commit to as a stretch goal, SMART goal, stretch goal for the year, for example. And then that's when you all you agree on it and you know what it is, but she'll bring it back. Dr. Thomas and her team brings that back. It's in here. And if you have questions about why X amount growth and not X amount, that is the time that you ask, because then there are typical reasons why the superintendent has brought a certain recommendation as far as what that growth might look like or what a decline or increase might look like, that kind of thing.
So
So-
that,
Go ahead.
I'm sorry.
No, you can.
That's very good, and that's clear. So again, it's one of those things that we must agree upon in terms of what that measurement is going to be, or whatever the outcome is going to be for that particular one, so that we'll know what we're evaluating. But it also becomes input to our decisions on the budget, right?
So that's where the board gets involved.
Right.
When it comes to the strategic plan, the initiatives and the action steps, they change from year to year. Your
Right.
overarching goals do not, and your major performance objectives don't either.
Right.
That's where y'all live. Because
Right.
if you had to vote on every time the staff changed an action step or an initiative,
No, we don't want to do that.
but what you will be voting on is when the superintendent brings recommendation that's going to affect the budget, or to hire these positions because we're getting at the SEL goal of whatever it is. That's when you get involved. And that's when you should get involved, because it's going to affect your budget. And if you're working your plan, your budget's going to align to that. And there won't be any surprises. That's
I'm good with it.
Okay, what happens when and you know, because this data in the past at least has been provided to us on the school level, which can get really confusing. Because you may have, let's say, 3 middle schools where the performance measure has been met, but then you have one that has either fallen behind or not improved. I mean, do you want you want the superintendent evaluation to be upbeat and positive, so you've got great news, but then you have this lagger, and how, because nothing is ever clear across the board, and I'm not sure how you finesse an evaluation when there is uneven development.
Well, it depends on your overarching goal in the plan related to that. What is it, middle school? Like there's 3 different middle schools or something?
Four.
And that's where y'all have to come to an agreement on that. And then you're going to ask the superintendent, what are her plans to work on those middle schools? Because I'm sure that the principals of those 2 middle schools, or however many, aren't performing, have a plan to address whatever deficiencies they've had with student achievement, whatever level, whatever subject it is.
Could I ask really quickly? It seems to me that I think where we keep getting bogged down in like the operations part of this is that we're seeing the goals and objectives. We saw very quickly last week some performance measures and indicators, and I think what my fellow board members are saying is we're not seeing benchmark year 1, year 2, year 3 goals. So there's not this sort of longitudinal approach to how we will be able to assess how the progress is being made. And I think until we can visually see that, just like 2 weeks ago when we were kind of caught up in not being able to see the performance measures and indicators, it's like, this is now the next step. When are we going to be able to see what your baseline year 1, year 2, year 3, year 4 goals are? I think we're just going to keep having this sort of circular conversation. So perhaps maybe the better approach at this executive session that we're about to have is to say, what do we as a board feel like we need to see in order to be able to feel comfortable with the annual performance in September? Do we need to see baseline year 1, 2, 3 goals in a chart, in a, you know, in a really clear format, and then we can move forward. I think until then, we're just going to keep kind of circling back to, we don't understand what we're looking at.
Well, I will tell you what is beautiful with Assembly, and y'all are going to get all the modules starting in July, I believe. When you load in your strategic plan into Assembly, you tie every single goal that you want into the superintendent's evaluation. And so what Assembly will do is, let's say she's already loaded in the baseline data, and you get this report card that you're approaching a goal, that's yellow. Didn't make the goal, it's red. Oh, you made the goal, it's green. And so you have a snapshot right there. And it makes it so much easier, because I understand where you're coming from, because it is a lot of information, right? And you really don't have that information yet for the baseline. And the staff is working on that, which is great, because the strategic plan right now is new. And so we're talking about this going forward for her for next year's. Right. So y'all are really in a good place to be working on this now for next year.
Thank you, Julie, and thank you, Dr. Anderson. And I think you're exactly right, Dr. Anderson. That's where some of the ambiguity lies. And unfortunately, it's where I think it's a messy process, and it's difficult for most of us who are type A to do messy, because it's difficult for me to live in that space. And it's been difficult for my team. And so I think part of where we've struggled is, I don't know if as a board and as an evaluation committee, you know, maybe some of it is what comes first, right? The horse or the cart. And so sometimes when we bring items, then it's like, no, we're not sure that's what we want. So then we back. And then it's like, wait, we're not seeing enough. Then we bring it. And it's like, no, you all already figured it out. And that's not what we want. So like a lot of what is asked for, which is the same thing that happened a couple of weeks ago with the initiatives. We had the initiatives, but then we bring the initiatives and people kind of get bogged down. So we pull them back, then we pull them back, and it's too bare bones. And so people don't feel like they have enough. The same thing has happened with this data. If we recall, when we met about it a couple of weeks ago, we put out a little of that conversation, but then it was, we're not sure if this is what we want. So we said, okay, we'll wait and let's talk about it as a team. And so a lot of this work has been done. Like I could pull up on the screen now almost everything you're asking for. But the directive we kind of thought we heard at the last board meeting was, let's wait and let the board look at what performance measures are best. And then we come forward and give you that information. And I think that's the part we all are struggling with, is just because everybody wants something definitive, but then you get something too definitive and people don't feel like they've had a voice in it. And so trying to find that sweet spot of us giving it to you and it looks like you're not having input because you're the board and this is the area the board can, and I don't use this word, it sounds ugly, but I'm not being ugly, but this is the area you can control. And so when we give it, it's like we're trying to take that control from the board. But then when we don't give it, it's vague and evasive. And so then it's like, well, what are y'all really doing? And then my folks are back here like, we need to have some idea of what our targets are. So they're like these hidden documents, not in a secretive way, but they're having to have conversations with their teams to guide the work. So they have to set some soft targets. So I think that's kind of been the rub, is how much do we do? And then how are we crossing over into the board space? And then the board, how much do you do? And where are you crossing over into operations? And it does get really messy and it's hard for those of us who normally kind of have the same kind of brains to operate there. So I'm glad you brought that up, Dr. Anderson. And then you said what you said, Julie, because it's like, how do we get to that space where we are collaborating on what this looks like? Because we're ready. We have the baseline. Like I said, I could give them to you right now, but we wanted to come back and have a collective time to determine what are these measures.
And so I would urge the board to listen to that and to listen to it in a way that it is led by your CEO. Because if you look at what's here and the information, this is where you get into delegating the authority to the expert in this work in terms of bringing you that baseline, of course, and then also then saying, and here's the amount of growth we are focused on over X period of time. And then the board then will ask essential questions. That doesn't mean that the superintendent won't tweak something based on your question, but then she would definitely verify and justify why she is suggesting that that is the metric that should be used when you're looking at what growth should look like. Because when you see a baseline, you're going to anticipate X amount of growth or change between the baseline and the summative, let's just say. And so, especially if we're talking about student achievement and formatives, then your superintendent will say, well, here's the amount of growth that we can say we can agree on. Because in some cases, for example, she'll know that you can only really commit to a year and a 1.5 grade level growth, for example, or two grade levels in X period of time, because research is pretty clear on those items, and she'll say that, and you might or might not have known that, and that's what she'll provide, and then she'll adjust or tweak, or you'll adjust or tweak based on that. So what I'm suggesting is that here's where you would rely on the superintendent to bring that information to you based on all of the research and the body of work, and then you ask essential questions and make adjustments from there. Not the reverse of that. That's where it gets bogged down with some boards also.
Yeah, it's a fine line. I understand, because you want to input into it, but you aren't the educational experts technically. So it's okay to ask those questions, though. That's how I learned, because the superintendent and the staff would present all the metrics that we were going to be basing our ratings on for the strategic plan that we ultimately used in her evaluation as well. And why can we only expect 2% growth a year on the MAP test for third graders? Because you take it from the first year and you go up 5 years. And so you have these certain increments each year. And there's so much research and data behind those. If you ask questions, you'll learn why. But it's not necessarily to question them, it's just to learn.
Absolutely. And I think it's also really an opportunity to have that explanation given at the time that that goal is presented, so we don't have to ask the questions.
Right. It's a lot, though. It can be really overwhelming.
It is a lot. And so we keep saying it's overwhelming, but the reality is this is the work that is happening every single day in every single classroom.
Right.
And so, and we have a staff that kind of directs that work or is in charge of that work. And so if we're not holding ourselves accountable for that to the point that we can report it out, not only to the board, but to the community and the public whose dollars we're spending, then I'm not sure how we get past this. And again, it's a lot, but you do a lot. And so why not take credit for it is how I see it. So anyway, I like it looks like if I click on either one of those little arrows, it's going to tell me more about that particular thing.
Are you talking about each of these?
Yeah, right. Oh no, that's just the rating part of it. Okay.
So yeah, when you click on it, it expands everything.
So what we would love to do, and I don't know how this fits, Dr. Deitman, with kind of the vision. So I know that we need to have an executive session to finalize this and align it to my evaluation. But the team would also love to have some of the conversation we're talking about, because I can speak to it, but you also have division heads for a reason who can really speak to it in much greater depth. And that's what they, even today I've had over the last 2 days, my one-on-ones with all of our cabinet, and they all had these wonderful presentations, and they were like, okay, but I need you to be able to say this, and you need to be able to explain that. And I go back to what Ms. Davis said, it's a lot. And yeah, I can but not in my, just being honest, you can't be an expert on everything. And so they welcome the opportunity to be able to discuss this baseline data, discuss what tools were used to capture, why we're looking at iReady versus maybe looking at MAP. We looked at some data today, and what iReady gave us was within like 2 to 4% difference in what the milestones showed. So we were excited because it was a good predictor. But that's something that Mr. Gaskins is like, I want to talk to the board. I want them to see that this is what we did. This is what milestones showed. This is where we got the numbers from. This will help us to gauge. This is what we're going to do quarterly. All the things we're talking about. So it still may be good to have a conversation dedicated, not like in a 5-hour board meeting where everybody is exhausted, but if we could have a special meeting just to look at the strategic plan and look at the performance measures, allow each department person to walk through that and allow you to ask questions. And then based on that greater depth of understanding and what our recommendations are, we go from that to then determining which ones of those then I would be maybe evaluated on.
You
I
just
like that.
described a best practice. I mean, we did that all the time. And you absolutely have to rely on your department heads to make those presentations, especially around student data, because you have someone, I'm sure as big as y'all are, dedicated just to analyzing data.
I didn't know if it was a best practice, but it surely seemed to make sense. And they
Yeah.
were clearly not trusting me today. So I spent a lot of time. They were like, write this note down. And because they know the work and they want you all to understand and be able to know that data that they're giving you and be able to ask those questions. So they want that opportunity because all of them spent an extensive amount of time preparing what Dr. Anderson was just referencing, so that it can be shared with you all and you all can interact and ask those questions.
Those are some of my meetings because you got to interact with the staff and drill down. But you're the CEO. You can't know everything and every detail about everything. If you did, then you don't need a staff, right? So this is not humanly possible.
I felt like I was cramming for a test today. Okay, now what are you going to say if they ask you this? And they were literally doing that. Well, you need to be. I'm like, okay, y'all are stressing me out, but it's because they own it and they want people to understand what they do. So
in my 9 years or however long, 8 years, 9 years on the board, this is absolutely essential communication that we've had before. And so literally my first 2 or 3 years, and this is 2 superintendents ago, we had these presentations from staff prior to us agreeing on the strategic plan. And so, I mean, it literally was just a presentation. And so we had them before we started doing work sessions and board meetings. I don't remember how we did it before, but literally the staff did present this information so that by the time we got to this part of having an evaluation discussion, we knew and understood what was actually happening in the district. So I think that's a great idea. I love your staff for suggesting that. And I certainly am in favor of hearing from them.
And so that's also an example of what you heard Dr. Thomas mention of a strategy going forward that may be already implemented or can be, where that's a part of the evaluation of your district leaders too, because that's the work that you're depending on them to do, because it's assigned to them based on different components of the strategic plan. And like Dr. Thomas just mentioned, she can't do all of this work. That's why she has people on board as experts and different leaders across these various buckets, and they're responsible for bringing these items to the table to get to your strategic priorities. And then it becomes a mechanism for her evaluation for them as well.
Absolutely.
So, yeah.
And I will say, Dr. Thomas, since y'all are still finalizing and finessing the plan, Dr. Barker has an audit service. He can come in and make sure that you guys are on the right road for your action items, your action teams. He'd be more than happy to help y'all if you get stuck with anything, or if you just want another eye to look at it. He's more than happy to do that. I can send you his contact info.
Thank you. He's with GSBA.
Yes, he was
Mhm.
county superintendent, but he retired. He's been with GSBA since July 1. So he's the director of strategic planning. He works with Lenita Jackson,
Okay.
and they do so many plans a year. So they're a great resource. That's why I always call him for advice on certain things. So I called him yesterday about this.
I like that there's a tool
Mm-hmm.
that we can use to record our individual results. That was always a very awkward thing for us in the past because one person ended up, doing the aggregation and then sending it back, giving it back to everybody, and then taking it back up again, trying to maintain confidentiality. So this really is an answer to being able to absolutely give each board member autonomy in doing the evaluation.
Yeah, and it's confidential, and it's just the same as the self-eval that y'all did last year. It's the same platform, but we'll be happy to get something scheduled for y'all to train if Lisa doesn't feel comfortable doing it herself. It's free. You just call them and they'll walk you through it. Y'all can do it individually or y'all can schedule something as a board. But it's especially for the new board members who haven't used it yet.
Well, I don't think it's just going to be the new board members. This entire board is new, except me and Greg, and it's new to us because we now have 7 new counterparts. And so I think we should be included in all of that because I do feel like the cohesion isn't going to be here if we continue doing it the way we're doing it.
That's good.
There's a question in the chat about if you're having a meeting to go over the information that's in here, and will you have access to Assembly to do that? I know you're going to have access to Assembly to do it. You all would just need to schedule the time to go over it. Julie, I think this is an example of just having dropped in information that you provided thus far, knowing that you might or might not have approved some of this. So we know some of it would change based on what you end up with. So.
Right.
And similar people are always available to come out and walk you through different pieces of this. You already have it. So if you need someone to or even to do it virtually to help you walk through the ease of use of some of this, because I know it's the first time, but it is really an efficient tool for you to upload information and right there at your fingertips. And even this rating scale that you see can be changed. That's how it appears now. You can change it if you need to.
That's why it's so easy to tailor it to how you want it.
So we can do that ourselves and we don't have to, put in a request for somebody to make that change?
Yeah, y'all just need to come together as a governance team with Dr. Thomas and decide on what the measures are going to be in terms of how she's going to be rated.
And I was speaking specifically to how easy is it to change these measurements and these particular modules.
It's a template thing. It's real easy. You make one change and everything changes.
All right, thank you.
But, if Lisa doesn't know how to do it, simply staff can easily walk through it.
And so just to clarify, to be sure, I'm hearing what I think I'm hearing. It sounds like generally the board is interested in a special call meeting, the board and the superintendent, a special call meeting to review the full strategic plan that has all of the other information, the initiatives, the outcomes, before going into an executive session, but using that call meeting to be able to, ask any follow-up questions or delve deeper into the portions that we see. Is that what I'm hearing, Julie and board members?
I think that you definitely need to finish your work on the strategic plan, and come to agreement there. But just remember that some of those action steps, the evidence, all that stuff should be staff recommended, and because that's the how you do things, and the board does not get involved in the how.
Yeah, we do that.
Yeah, and I know that's where a lot of boards struggle.
Right, we'll struggle too, but if you just keep reminding us, it's how.
Not the how.
Well, and I guess that's why I was just trying to get clarity on if we're in a call meeting to go over the strategic plan, the assumption is that that information will already be filled in, like it will be the complete full package. That is that the superintendent has already added, to those overarching goals and things like that.
You've already voted on the 30,000.
Right.
That's all you need to vote on when it comes to the strategic plan. You don't have to vote on that other stuff.
Okay.
Out of her business, right? Stay up here because this is enough work to do on its own. You don't really need to go down there and deal with that stuff too. But if you have questions about some of the indicators or evidence or whatever you want to call them or action steps, ask questions. Why is this the goal? Just clarifying questions are okay to ask. Sam, any thoughts on that?
I guess if it's not too much of a burden, it would be nice to hear from some of these staff who are so excited about their data to get a sense for why these data are what they're choosing. And that would take, I just don't want to add extra burden because I know that's, rather than asking Dr. Thomas to explain it all, maybe a couple of energetic Mr. Gaskins and team could share it with us.
They can definitely do that because they can just tell you why those particular metrics were chosen, why particular assessments are chosen. In some cases that, again, the baselines aren't there, but Dr. Blankenship can speak to the surveys that already exist at the state level that we will return to using and why, or in some instances, there's surveys that are being created. We're working with James on that, why that decision is being made, but they can share with you what's being used or what's being developed and why those decisions were made.
So is that the question that Dr. Gant just asked us? Or is this a different question?
I thought it was all aligned, but I could be wrong.
Yeah, my question was what's going to happen at this called meeting? And we're going to be presented with the measures, but also hopefully given an explanation of the measures so we don't have to every single time say, well, why that one? Well, why that one?
Exactly.
We can handle those questions with a little bit of a presentation with the why. And then if we have other questions, we can ask those other questions, but we won't have to keep asking. Yeah.
Yeah, that was what I'd asked for when she started talking about that. So yeah, let's definitely, I'm all in favor of it. I don't know if anybody's not in favor of it.
I'm telling you, those types of sessions are very educational for board members.
I just wanted to clarify for myself, because I, walked away from a couple of meetings thinking, I don't even know what I'm doing. So maybe I have a different understanding of a strategic plan. But yeah, that information basically would be presented to us in whole package and we can ask questions. But going back to that very maybe first or second slide, our specific duty is not to change initiatives to get into bogged down with that work or the specific measures I'm just trying to be sure that I have a correct understanding.
The thing is about the strategic plan, let's say that the indicators for this year are going to be set. They're going to change next year, right? Because they're fluid. They change all the time. You exceed something, you meet them, you want to change your goal, you want to keep stretching yourself. And so she doesn't need to enter all that evidence into her evaluation. She needs to choose what we're working on this year and what's applicable to that. So don't expect that the evaluation is going to have as much information and metrics in it like the strategic plan will.
And so that strategic plan, though, you're housing that in Assembly too, is that right?
And
so they are going to be able to update the quarterly things in Assembly, and so we will have our dashboard.
Yeah, right now you'll have the evaluation module, but there's a planning module, and they marry together so nicely. And they also, when you get the planning module and you have the meetings module, every single meeting, every action item ties to something in your strategic plan. So it keeps the board focused that you're working on the work, that you're working on those strategic goals.
And is it also our historical archive of our work?
Yes.
So I haven't had that I've never had the comparison between Assembly and the board docs and stuff like that yet. So I don't have any clue as to what Assembly can do versus what board docs was doing. But I do want to make sure that we don't lose any functionality because we don't have staff to go in and maintain paper records or even electronic records. So maybe we'll have that conversation at some point.
Absolutely, all the records from, because y'all were on Assembly before, you were on board docs. We'll have, we'll work with board docs and whatever they give the information in to archive all that stuff. So
I think that's probably gonna be another meeting for where somebody actually explains stuff that we're gonna make that change. So thank you.
Well, I think that Dr. I could be crossing over a personal conversation with the board meeting, but I think it was, there was some information shared about when we planned on, when the district planned on transitioning over to Assembly as it relates to the budget and things like that.
Yes, I thought it was like July. I think we were going to go ahead and pay for it in July, and then Ms. Palmer was going to start some overlap. But the way board docs is set up, we have to, it's paid in the rears. And so we were finishing out like a commitment time. But then if I recall correctly, there was some discussion back and forth with the board a little about the need to change. And so we thought we were changing. Then there was some discussion, and I think Ms. Palmer was a little confused about really what was wanted from her. So she's like, am I doing both? Which she said, if we need to do both, because there are parts of Assembly we definitely need to do with some of those modules. Her preference was not to have to manage two different systems. But like, again, we had gotten some conflicting directives.
We haven't really had a board vote on this yet then to switch to Assembly, or is there a board vote required, or how we go forward? Because I'd like to get that out of my mind, because that's the only thing that bothers me is like, I know we voted for board docs. And so are we going to vote to take it out? And if that's not how we do things going forward, I'm fine. Just tell me that.
I know that when we went to Assembly, it was called e-board back then, we didn't vote on it because it was in our budget, and it didn't exceed a certain budget amount.
Yeah, it doesn't hit the threshold.
So well, that doesn't matter because we still get a report on everything that's spent, whether it hits the threshold or not. Is that not right?
Right, but I didn't think it had to be voted on, is what I'm saying, because it didn't hit the threshold. But I'm not sure. I didn't think.
Again, it's just an awareness thing.
Yeah, and I don't know if y'all have had a demonstration about all the things that Assembly does.
No.
Yet it's more comprehensive than board docs. It's cheaper. And
I've not had that.
If you have input into how to change something, you just call us and we make those changes. Because we focus on boards. That's all. I mean, GSBA created it back in what, Sam, 2003 or something.
That while back. Yep.
And so we're in like 26 states.
I'm sorry.
We're in like 26 states. Most school boards are using them in different states, 26 to be exact. So, it's really whatever y'all want to do. The thing is, you want to use a tool that's comprehensive, and you don't want to have to go back and forth. So
right. That was getting challenging for Ms. Palmer. She was getting a little, it was getting difficult. So she was like, I just want somebody to telling me what I'm supposed to do.
I know, and I would like to stop asking the question. I'm just accustomed to having a vote on things that impact the board, if it's a tool or something like that. But again, sorry, I've been here a little bit longer, that's all. And so those things were brought to us, whether it hit the threshold or not. That wasn't because it's in the budget doesn't necessarily approve the spending, especially as it affects everybody. So I don't know. I just want to know where we are.
Easy to use, I will say that. It made my life so much easier when I was an administrator for DeKalb and when I was a board member. I saved paper, so many trees. But it's whatever y'all want.
I'm gonna leave that one alone. So I'm good. I think we have a plan going forward. Sounds like it's almost 9. Ooh, it's after 9. Okay.
Yeah, it is after 9. So I did, before we wrap up, Julie and Sam, I just wanted to check in to see if we're at an okay point to close out.
Yes.
Y'all
Yes,
feel-
I think everybody got an idea of where you are right now as far as what it could look like.
Mhm.
Whatever vehicle or instrument you use, the process that you talked about should be the same. You know, board docs versus assembly, that kind of thing. Of course, you already have assembly, so you should take full advantage of it. Seemingly, you already have it, so
We have
take
the
full advantage of it.
evaluation module because we used it for our self-assessment.
That's right.
So I think that's
Right.
why we have that for.
And we'll
Right.
use it again for the self-assessment. That'll be coming out,
Right.
soon in preparation. So yeah.
But we don't have the full assembly yet.
Right. Okay.
No, I think y'all used to. Yeah, y'all had the full assembly module, and then Dr. Means came and he changed it because he was a board docs guy. So, I mean,
We voted on that.
yeah, you probably did.
Yep. Well, I think we don't have to decide whether we're going to vote now. It does sound like it may be helpful at some point to have the board, some information presented on assembly to the full board. And it does sound like, I mean, it definitely impacts us, but it also impacts the district. This is they put the work there. They present the policies, all of those things. So
Perfectly fair.
I don't think I don't think we have to decide that tonight.
But can we decide going forward that we will go ahead and bring it to the board so that we can see that demonstration and then we can put this to rest, and then I don't have to keep jumping back and forth in my mind between what's happening with board docs versus assembly, and yeah, can we just, that would be helpful.
Absolutely. We can get that scheduled next time.
Already written it down to get with Ms. Palmer and we can get it scheduled.
Thank you so much. I appreciate that.
Awesome.
It's a
Well,
function of my age.
Well, thank you all so much. I know it's after 9, so I do thank you for your time. We'll be back in touch at some point. I know Dr. Dykeman and her team will be working on our next steps. We'll also, Dr. Maddox and myself and Dr. Thomas, when we meet, we'll figure out the call meeting so that we can get a full presentation and have the opportunity to ask questions and link everything in our minds because it's a lot of moving parts. Yeah, we'll continue onward. So thank you so much. We are at the place in our agenda for adjournment. The floor is open.
I move that we adjourn.
Thank you, Ms. Davis.
Second.
All right, second. I don't see any objections, so we are adjourned at 9:19 p.m. Thank you.
Thank you. And it's not that I
Everyone.
want to leave you guys, but let's talk about something fun, right? Have a
All right,
great
good night.
evening.
Good
See you at
night.
graduation tomorrow.
Yeah, see you tomorrow.
Okay, bye.